When news broke that the United States had moved to capture Maduro, most people saw it as a regional power play. But the real audience wasn't in Caracas. It was watching quietly from Beijing. Because what happened in Venezuela in those chaotic hours wasn't really about Venezuela at all. It was a signal, a shot across the bow, a live demonstration of what happens when you align yourself too closely with the wrong superpower at the wrong moment in history. And if you think this story is about oil or socialism or democracy, you've already missed the point. This is about something far more fundamental. This is about the architecture of influence in a world where two empires are quietly carving up the future, and where every small nation must now choose which empire's protection is worth more than the other's revenge. Let me take you back to a moment most people have forgotten. It was 2007. Hugo Chavez was at the height of his power. Oil prices were soaring. Venezuela was flush with cash. And Chavez, theatrical and defiant as ever, stood before the cameras and announced that Venezuela would no longer bow to Washington. He expelled American diplomats. He threatened to cut off oil supplies. He called George W. Bush the devil at the United Nations. And then he did something that seemed, at the time, almost symbolic. He flew to Beijing, he shook hands with Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao, and he signed a series of agreements that would, over the next 15 years, bind Venezuela's fate to China in ways that most observers completely failed to understand. At the time, Western analysts dismissed it. They saw it as pageantry. They saw Chavez as a loudmouth with an oil wealth and a flair for anti-American rhetoric. But what they didn't see was the quiet architecture being built beneath the noise. China wasn't interested in Chavez's ideology. China didn't care about Bolivarian socialism or 21st century revolution. What China cared about was something much simpler and much more strategic. China wanted a foothold in America's backyard. And Venezuela, with its vast oil reserves and its eagerness to spite Washington, was the perfect opportunity. Over the next decade, China poured more than $60 billion into Venezuela. Not as charity, not as aid, but as loans. Loans backed by oil. Loans that gave China the right to import hundreds of thousands of barrels of Venezuelan crude every single day, regardless of what happened to the regime in Caracas. This was the new model. This was what Beijing had learned from watching the United States stumble through Iraq and Afghanistan. You don't invade. You don't occupy. You don't try to export your political system. You just lend money. You build infrastructure. You lock in resource flows. And you wait. By the time Nicolas Maduro inherited power in 2013, Venezuela was no longer a sovereign economy. It was a tributary state. Every month, tankers filled with Venezuelan oil sailed not to Houston or Rotterdam, but to the refineries of Guangdong. Every year, Venezuela's debt to China grew larger, more complex, more impossible to escape. And Beijing, patient as always, simply refinanced. Extended terms, rolled over payments, because China wasn't trying to make a profit on these loans. China was trying to make Venezuela dependent, and it worked. Now fast forward to the present. Maduro's government is a hollowed-out shell. The economy has collapsed. Millions have fled. Hyperinflation has destroyed the currency. And yet somehow Maduro remains in power. How? This is the question that has baffled Washington for years. How does a regime this incompetent, this brutal, this universally despised, continue to survive? And the answer, the uncomfortable answer that no one in the State Department wants to say out loud, is that Maduro survives because Beijing allows him to survive. Not through military force, not through diplomatic recognition, but through something far more subtle. Through the quiet continuation of those oil-for-loan agreements, through the steady flow of spare parts for Venezuela's decaying oil infrastructure, through the maintenance contracts signed with Chinese state firms that keep the drills turning and the crude flowing even as the rest of the country falls apart. Beijing doesn't love Maduro. Beijing doesn't care if he lives or dies. But Beijing cares very much about the precedent. Because if the United States can simply remove a government that has tied itself to China, then what message does that send to every other country in the global South that is currently weighing whether to accept Chinese infrastructure loans? This is where the story gets interesting. Because for years, Washington's strategy toward Venezuela was incoherent. Sanctions piled on top of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, funding for opposition groups, recognition of a rival government. And none of it worked. Maduro stayed. And every time Washington tightened the noose, Maduro turned east. More oil to China, more debt restructuring, more dependence. Until finally, someone in Washington realized that the real problem wasn't Maduro. The real problem was that Maduro had become a node in a much larger network, and that network had Beijing at its center. So when the operation to move against Maduro finally came, it wasn't announced with speeches or press conferences. It was quiet, surgical. And the justification had nothing to do with democracy or human rights. The justification was drugs, narco-terrorism, corruption, charges that could be filed in American courts, charges that made this not a regime change operation, but a law enforcement action. This distinction matters because it allows Washington to claim that it is not overthrowing a government, it is simply arresting a criminal, and that distinction gives Beijing very little room to respond. Think about the calculus from Beijing's perspective. If the United States had invaded Venezuela militarily, China could have condemned it as imperialism. If the United States had orchestrated a coup, China could have rallied the global South around the principle of sovereignty. But an arrest, based on criminal charges filed in a neutral court? What is Beijing supposed to say? That the United States has no right to enforce its own laws? That drug trafficking should be ignored because the trafficker happens to be friendly with China? Beijing's response was muted, carefully worded. And that silence spoke volumes. Because what happened in Venezuela wasn't really about Venezuela, it was a proof of concept. It was Washington demonstrating that it still has tools that Beijing does not. Beijing can lend money. Beijing can build ports. Beijing can lock in resource agreements. But Beijing cannot project coercive power in the Western Hemisphere the way Washington can. Not yet. And this operation was designed to remind every government in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, that there are limits to what Chinese patronage can protect you from. Now here is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because if you are a small country trying to navigate this new world, trying to figure out whether to accept Chinese loans or American aid, what lesson do you draw from Venezuela? The lesson is that choosing sides is no longer optional. The lesson is that neutrality is becoming impossible. Because the United States and China are not competitors in the way that the United States and the Soviet Union were competitors. They are not offering two different ideological systems and letting you pick. They are offering two different forms of dependency, and both of them come with consequences. If you take Chinese money, you get infrastructure. You get loans with fewer conditions than the IMF. You get roads and ports and power plants. But you also get debt. You get opacity. You get a relationship where the terms can shift and the leverage can grow, and you wake up one day and realize that you no longer control the most valuable assets in your own country. And if Beijing decides that your government is no longer useful, the money stops. The spare parts stop. The relationship freezes. and you are left with half-finished projects and unpayable loans. If you take American money, you get access to the global financial system. You get trade agreements. You get security guarantees. But you also get conditions. You get demands for transparency, for governance reforms, for alignment on human rights. And you get the knowledge that if you step too far out of line, if you align yourself with the wrong partner, the United States has tools that no other country has. The ability to freeze your assets, the ability to cut you off from dollar transactions, the ability, as we saw in Venezuela, to arrest your leaders. This is the new great game. And it is not being played on the battlefields of Europe or the waters of the Pacific. It is being played in the capital cities of countries that most people have never heard of. Countries where Chinese firms are building highways and American agencies are monitoring elections. Countries where the local elites are trying desperately to play both sides, to take money from Beijing and security from Washington, and to hope that they never have to choose. But Venezuela shows that you do have to choose. Eventually. And the cost of choosing wrong is not just economic, it is existential. Now let's talk about what this means for China, because Beijing is watching this very carefully, and what Beijing sees is a gap, a vulnerability. The vulnerability is this: for all of China's economic power, for all of its loans and infrastructure projects, China still cannot protect its client states from American coercion. Not in the Western Hemisphere. Not yet. And this is a serious problem. Because if you are a government in Africa or Latin America, and you are weighing whether to deepen your ties with Beijing, you have to ask yourself a very simple question. If things go wrong, if Washington decides that I am a problem, will Beijing be able to protect me? And the answer, as of right now, is no. This is why Beijing is investing so heavily in what it calls its Global Security Initiative. This is why Chinese state media has been talking more and more about the need for a multipolar world order. This is why China is slowly, carefully, beginning to build the instruments of coercive power that can operate beyond its immediate borders. Not through military bases, not through invasion, but through influence, through media, through technology, through the quiet construction of alternative systems that allow countries to survive outside the American-dominated financial architecture. But these systems are not ready yet. And that gap, that period of vulnerability, is the window that Washington is trying to exploit. The message being sent to every Chinese client state is simple. Beijing can give you money, but we can take away your freedom. Beijing can build your infrastructure, but we can destroy your economy. Beijing can offer you an alternative, but we are still the hegemon. And here is the deeper irony. The more Washington does this, the more it validates Beijing's long-term strategy. Because every time the United States uses its financial or legal or coercive power to punish a country for getting too close to China, it proves to the rest of the world that the American-led order is not a rules-based system. It is a power-based system. It is a system where the rules apply to you, but not to us. And that realization is exactly what China needs to convince the global South that an alternative is necessary. This is the paradox at the heart of the new Cold War. Washington's short-term victories are accelerating its long-term decline, because every country that watches what happened to Maduro is now thinking about how to insulate itself, how to build redundancy, how to make sure that it is not the next Venezuela. And the only country offering that insurance is China. So what does this all mean? It means that the arrest of Maduro, or the move against Maduro, whatever form it ultimately took, was not the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of a much longer and much more dangerous competition. A competition where the prize is not territory or ideology, but influence. The ability to shape the choices that smaller nations make. The ability to determine who gets to rise and who gets to fall. And in this competition, both sides are playing a game that neither fully understands. Because the world that is emerging is not bipolar in the way the Cold War was bipolar. It is fragmented, messy, chaotic. There are no clear blocks, no ideological dividing lines. Just 1,000 small countries trying to navigate between two giants, trying to extract what they can from both, trying not to get crushed in the process. Venezuela was supposed to be a warning. But warnings only work if the people receiving them believe that they have an alternative. And right now, for much of the world, the alternative to American pressure is Chinese money. And the alternative to Chinese debt is American coercion. Neither is freedom. Neither is sovereignty. Both are forms of dependence. And the only question left is which form of dependence is more survivable. This is the world we are entering. A world where every small nation is Venezuela. Where every decision about infrastructure or debt or trade is also a decision about which superpower you are willing to make yourself vulnerable to, and where the cost of getting that decision wrong is not measured in lost elections or economic downturns, but in the survival of your government, your sovereignty, and your future. So when you hear about Maduro, when you hear about sanctions or arrests or coups, do not think about Venezuela. Think about the dozens of other countries watching. Think about the leaders in Nairobi and Jakarta and Lusaka who are looking at what happened and asking themselves a very simple question. If I take Chinese money, will I end up like Maduro? And if I refuse Chinese money, will I be able to survive without it? Because that is the real story, not what happened to one man in one country, but what that one moment revealed about the structure of power in a world that no longer has a single center, a world where influence is currency, where dependency is strategy, and where every nation, no matter how small, is being forced to choose between two futures, neither of which it controls. This is the new great game, and Venezuela was just the opening move.